What a great day to build a piece of furniture. Welcome to the Great British Woodshop. Today I'm going to build a very useful and space-saving piece. And I got some antique design ideas for this project from some tables that I found at one of my favourite properties just south of London. Parts of the home here at Polesden Lacey are several hundred years old, but the inside was totally transformed in the early 20th century. The library is pretty much as it was 100 years ago, and it was the owner, Mrs. Greville's favourite room. Elegant, but very comfortable, and it's filled with fine pieces of furniture, like this piece here. This is called a Pembroke table. It's made from mahogany, and it has a drop leaf either side. There's a drawer that runs all the way through, and on this end there's a false drawer front. And the legs are tapered on all four sides, and it has wheels at the bottom to help you move it around more easily. Now there's another Pembroke drop leaf table over here I wanted to show you. This one is a very fine piece. It's veneered in a burr yew, and it has a fan medallion here in the centre, and it's inlaid in some sort of fruitwood, and we don't know what that is. And down the bottom the legs are also very elegant, and they're also flared. Now the Trust has very kindly allowed me to show you how this mechanism operates, but only if I put on some gloves to protect the piece. Now this arm that's hinged here in the centre of the table supports the drop leaf, and it folds away into a recess in the side of the table. The top and the leaf are hinged with what's called a rule joint, and that provides additional support for the leaf throughout its entire length. It presents a more finished look to the piece, and it hides the hinges whether the leaf is up or down. There's a lot of great ideas in this, and I think I'll use more than one of them in today's project. Well, here it is. I call it the Compact Kitchen Diner. It's made from solid beech, and like the Pembroke tables, I put my drawers in the ends. The drawers are constructed with dovetail joints and a couple of slots that ride on some runners. I made two stools, and these stools store on some more runners that sit underneath the drawer. Now you can get commercially available versions of this table, but they usually only seat 2 people, and I've built this one big enough to seat 4. And the other thing those other tables have usually is a gate leg that supports the leaf, and you're forever banging your knee on it. So I've come up with a different idea. I've got a cantilevered arm that goes from the top all the way across to the leaf, and it slides out for the leaf to be stored away. Like all good drop leaf tables, I've gone for a rule joint, and that'll also support the leaf throughout its length. And it's on wheels, so when you're finished using it, you can drop the leaves down, push it up against the wall, and it takes up hardly any space. Now there's enough to do for 2 programs here, and the first thing I'm going to do is build these. Now I get a head start with these 3 legs, and I rip these out of a piece of material similar to this, and I'll get 3 legs out of this piece. Now this is 50mm thick stock, and I've set the fence on the saw table to 45mm because the finished dimension of these legs will be 40mm square. Now I'm always conscious of workshop safety. The only time I ever remove the guards on these saws is so you can see more clearly what I'm doing. Otherwise they're an important safety feature and they should always be left on. And because I'm picking up a lot of secondary dust off this cut, I'll wear a dust mask and, as always, safety glasses. Now a couple of passes over the jointer to clean up the first face, and then I'll rotate it around, keep that face up against the fence, and then make the next edge square to the face. And then it's over to the thickness planer, and I'll run the other 2 sides through until I get it down to 40mm square. Well, the next thing I want to do is to cut all these legs to length. I'll set the stop to 790, and that'll make sure that all the legs are exactly the same. I'll square up one end, and then slide it down to the stop, and then cut the other end. Now these 6 legs get 28 mortises in total, and they're in different positions, and there are 3 different sizes to the mortises. So this is something I need to pay some attention to make sure I orient these boards in the right position. I've put an indicator mark where I want the mortises to start and stop on this leading edge of this first board, and I've clamped them all together to make sure they don't move. And I'm going to use my square to connect a line all the way across all boards at the same time. And the first mark is down 5mm from the top. That's where the mortises, all the mortises on all boards will actually start. Next I put a mark 40mm down, and that'll be for some of the mortises are at that length. And next I put another mark 85mm down, and some of the mortises will be that length. Now down on the bottom I put a mark 5mm up from the bottom, and all the mortises across the bottom are all the same length, they're all 40mm. But again, they'll be in different positions depending on which face of the board involved. Now I'll just rotate all the boards around, reclamp it, and keep marking out all the way around until I get every face on all 6 boards marked up. Now I'm just looking at these boards to pick which face I like best to be facing out. And I don't like that. That face there isn't as attractive as that. And that's the sort of face that I want facing on both sides, particularly on this corner. And I'm not going to get that with that piece. So I can put that in the middle. That looks pretty good on both sides. So that looks like a good combination. Now I'm going to mark their positions with front left, front center, and I'm just going to go around so that these can stay in that position now throughout the entire process. It's front right. Next I'll mark positions for the bottom mortises, and these are relatively simple. They run around the perimeter and they're all to the outside of the legs. Next it's the rails in the center, and they get marked in the middle. And again, these are short ones. They go in that position. Well, I've taken the tabletop off so I can show you the positions where I need to cut mortises in the legs for this upper rail section. Now these two are the same. The rail gets mortised into the leg to the outside, and this block here is just nailed to this one, and it's a filler block, and it gives me a place where I can nail the draw runner to. The other two opposites are the same also, but this one gets mortised to the back of the leg, and it has a notch in it, and this one is fastened to this one, and this rail here and this leg have a pin either side, and that's where this support arm pivots on. So this rail gets marked to the outside, same there, and this one is on the inside, because this is where that dummy rail will sit, and I'll do the same to the other side. I've installed a 10mm straight cutting bit in the table. I've set the height 10mm above the surface of the table, and I've set the fence back 5mm, and that'll keep the rails flush with the leg. Now I'm going to mark some reference marks on the fence, and they'll be the two outside edges of the cutter. And I'm going to do that with my square. Put a line there, and just transfer that line up the fence. And I'll do the same on the other edge of the cutter. And I'll drop the board down onto the bit just behind the line, bring it back so it lines up with the line on the fence, and then push it all the way through to the stop line, and then lift it off. Well, I've finished all the mortises except for the mortises that go on the inside of the two center legs, and those mortises are right in the middle. So I've readjusted the fence so it's 15mm away, and then I can route these mortises on these legs. The only mortises I haven't marked out for are for these two narrow rails that sit above the drawer, and the tenons on these rails are 15mm long. Well, the next thing to do is to make all of the rails and these filler blocks for the whole table frame, and that starts over on the compound miter saw. Well, I'm going to rough cut all my rails to length, and then I'll mill it up to the correct dimensions, and then I'll be ready to add the tenons. Well, I got a good start on these rails. I've already completed the two short rails that sit above the drawer and the four wider rails that run around the top, and I'm in the middle of doing these rails that fit around the bottom of the table. I'm using the mortise and tenon jig. I'm going to just clamp this board in place, and this jig sets up by sliding these plates backwards and forwards and using this setup bar to set the length of the tenon. And the beauty of the jig is that once it's set up, you get perfectly repeatable results every time. I've also installed a bush in the bottom of the router, and that rides around the inside perimeter of these plates. And the bit removes the material around the outside and leaves the tenon in the center. Now where I've just notched out this corner on the rail, I'm left with a square tenon, and that's not going to fit into my rounded mortise. So to round that over, I'm just going to use a file. See if that fits. That's a beautiful thing. The leaf support arm has 2 grooves milled in it, and those grooves ride on 2 pins, one in the leg and one in the rail, and drilling holes for those dowel pins is next. I've come down 9.5mm and come in 9.5mm and put a point, that'll be the centre of the hole. And I'm using a brad point bit to drill it. I like these bits because the point's so sharp it helps me locate it exactly where I want and it won't wander. And I've also attached a little depth stop collar to the drill. And I'm just using the square to help me keep the bit perpendicular to the work. Now the 2 centre legs get pins as well, 9.5mm down and 9.5mm in. Now I bought these hardwood dowels down at the hardware store, and they're 8mm in diameter. You can just tap them in with a hammer. And then I'll trim them back to 6mm long at the table saw. Well, I must say I really like this steamed beech. I don't think it'll replace cherry as my favourite wood, but it goes pretty close. And it's steamed beech, and when they steam it, it changes the colour. It turns it into sort of a pinkish, reddish, brown colour. And believe it or not, there's more beech used in the United Kingdom than any other hardwood, particularly for kitchen pieces like this. I'm just checking for square, and it's slightly out. So what I'm going to do is just apply a little bit of clamp pressure to bring it into square, section by section. Well, that's one side done. During the break, I'll glue up the other side, and when we come back, I'll start milling up the pieces for the top. Welcome back to the Great British Woodshop. Our project is a compact kitchen diner, and it has 2 drop leaves either side of a centre section to form the tabletop, and these leaves are supported by a sliding arm instead of a gate leg. There are 2 drawers either end, and also a couple of stools. Now I got in a little early this morning and finished up the sanding on the base, and next I'm going to start making up this top. Well, here are 2 of the boards for one of the leaves, and now it's just a matter of deciding which face I want up. Now I'm not altogether thrilled with the colour match where these 2 boards join, but the growth rings are going in the right direction. This one's going down and this one's going up, and it's more important to keep the top stable, and alternating the growth rings is the way to do that. So I'm going to live with this colour. The next thing I'll do is mark for some biscuits. I'm going to put 4 across here, and I'll just eyeball them so they're around about even, and I'll cut those now. This is a handy gadget. It dispenses glue with just the right amount into the biscuit slots. Well, the next thing I'm going to do is make these 2 leaf support arms. They've got 2 grooves that are routed down either side, and those grooves ride on a couple of pins. One of the pins is in this centre leg, and the other pin is in the end of this rail. It's also notched out, and that notch sits around the rail behind it so that this arm can sit flush with the leg. Now the length of this piece of timber is from the top of the frame to the top of the bottom rail. And that distance is 740mm, and I'll cut these arms to length over at the compound miter saw. I'm marking out for the notch that will sit around the rail, and I'm coming in 20, and I'm just going to mark a line. I'm going to join these 2 lines up, and then I'm going to make another mark 100mm down, which is the length of the rail. I'll draw a line across there, and this is the material that I'm going to remove. And then the groove that we're going to put in is going to run down this side all the way down to here. I'm going to make this cut here on the bandsaw, and I'll make this cut at the table saw. To cut the grooves in the two support arms, I've installed a 9mm straight cutting bit in the router table, and that'll give enough clearance for these arms to pivot around those 8mm dowel pins. Now I've put a couple of lines on the fence as reference lines. These two inside lines represent the two outside edges of the cutter. And I've put a line here that's 5mm away from this line. And that'll enable me to drop this board, lining it up with that line onto the cutter, and then push it through until I get to the second line here, and that's where I'll stop the cut. Now to cut the groove on the other side, I'm going to use the line that was previously our stop line, and I'm going to drop that down on the cutter and then push the board all the way through until I get to the 5mm line and then lift it off. Now, the top of the support arm is rounded over, and that's to provide some clearance so that as it pivots round, it'll clear the tabletop. And that way the arm can pivot freely under the table. And I'm also going to put a radius on the bottom of the arm, and that's just to take the sharp corner off. And to mark that out, I'm just going to use a coffee cup and mark a curve. Just a little final sanding on their frame before I glue it up with some 120 grit paper in the random orbit sander. Well, this will complete the glue up of the frame. I'm just sticking some glue in all the mortise and tenons, and then I'll put the top section on and clamp it up, check it for square, and leave it to dry. Now, I can't check for square easily in these corners because the legs stick out and I can't get the square in there. So I've put a little piece of scrap wood that I'll use as a reference. And actually this one is out of square. So by tightening this clamp, I'll be able to bring it back into square while it dries. Well, I've given all the pieces for the top a sanding, and I've squared up one end, and now I'm going to cut them all to 760mm long. Now the centre section of the table gets an overload detail on both edges, and that consists of a rounded over corner and a little step detail that's above it, and that little step's called a quirk. Now I've set the cutter up in the router table to achieve this. I've raised it above the table by 5mm. That'll create that little quirk, and then this part here of the radius will cut the rounding over. The next thing to cut is this cove detail, and that folds up over the top of the overload. And I've installed a cove cutting bit in the router table, and now I can run both the leaves through. Now I'm marking out positions for the table hinges here, and I'm coming up 155mm and just putting a mark. I'll draw a line, and I'm actually going to use this line in conjunction with the jig, which I'll use to mortise out for the hinge. When I built the original project, I made up a couple of jigs, and this is one of them here. This is for the leaf side, or the drop leaf side of the table. And it's to mortise out for this hinge, which is a table hinge. Now, table hinges are unlike other hinges because they've got a longer leaf on one side than the other. And this long side here is the bit that the drop leaf attaches to. And that will go in this recess that I'm going to mortise out. Now when I go to the trouble of making up a jig, I write all the relevant details on it, so I've got it for future reference. In this case, it's a table hinge that's 38mm wide. I'm using a 19mm cutter in conjunction with a 1 1/4 inch bush installed in the router. I also attached a little strip of maple to the front of the jig, and that's to help me locate it in place up against the table. Now this edge of the opening here, I'm going to line up with the pencil line that I marked before. and then I'm going to clamp it in place. Now the router does a great job of cutting out the mortise, but it leaves a round corner, so I'm going to use this little corner chisel to square it up. Let's see if this fits okay. That's all right. Now I'm using a different jig for the center section, but pretty much the same process as before, just the opening's a little different size. And I'm going to line up the inside edge with the pencil line, clamp it in place, and remove the material in here for this side of the hinge. Now this side of the hinge fits in this mortise in the tabletop, and you'll notice that the barrel of the hinge stands up proud against the surface. So that needs to be recessed so that the hinge can sit flush with the top. And the recess for the barrel and the hinge needs to be directly in line with the shoulder on the rule joint, and that's in order to make the drop leaf function properly. To cut those recesses, I've installed a 5mm radius bit in the router and set up the guide fence in the right position, and I'll make those cuts next. Now I've fitted the hinges in here, and I'm going to put the screws in now just so I can check and see that the rule joint is operating properly. But before I do that, I'm going to use the self-centering drill bit and drill a couple of pilot holes into this beach. I'll just put a couple of 1/2" number 6 screws to hold it in place. Let's see if this opens. A bit squeaky, but no problem on that side. Both sides look pretty good. Now I'm going to disassemble it, and I'm going to round over all the corners. To cut the corners off on the 2 drop leaves, I'm going to measure in 200mm from each corner in both directions. And then I'm going to take my T-square and just draw a line to get an intersecting point. I'm just going to use a compass on that point and then scribe an arc. I've clamped the drop leaf to the workbench, and I'm going to cut just proud of the line using a jigsaw, and then I'll sand it back to the line on the sanding station. Well, we made a pretty good start on the compact kitchen diner. In the next program, we're going to make some drawers, make the stools, put on some wheels and a finish, and find a good home for this piece. This is the Great British Woodshop, and I'm David Free. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.